Welcome to the Networking with Michelle podcast, the show dedicated on providing you the how-tos of marketing and networking strategies. Here we believe in the Jim Rohn quote, success is nothing more than a few simple disciplines practiced every day. Hey, good people, we are back with another episode of Networking with Michelle. I'm your host, Michelle Gomez. Once again, very, very grateful to be in your presence today. I hope your week is going well. Share some good news with me, right? You can hit me up on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, email me, info@michellegomez.com. Tell me if you got some good news. I would love to hear it. Special shout out to Krista Rivers. Once again, thank you for your continuous support, always sharing the podcast, sharing the message through social media. You are appreciated. I do adore you. Thank you so much. Hey, got a question for you. Before I get to the guest, got a question for you. Have you ever considered on learning a new language? You know, of course you had to take it in high school, right? You had to take it in high school to graduate. Maybe you even had to take it in college, but now we're getting older and we're just like, Well, I do have a couple of friends. They're always talking about either learning a new language or maybe they want to go back to school. Come across a lot of people, they want to go back to school for an MBA, get international business, things of that nature. So this episode is for you. I was fortunate to come across Janina Klimas, and she's the author of Learn Any Language and a Practical Guide to Learn Any Language to Any Level of Fluency. And I thought this was a real interesting interview, and I did it because it was going to be something outside of my norm. And then it made sense as things came together. For example, my mom, my parents are from Cameroon, West Africa, and they have their tribal dialect, but speak English and everything. And I think because of that, my upbringing, I've been able to pick up accents and dialects very well. And even though I don't speak another language, I've been able to kind of like understand people just a little bit better if they have an accent or a dialect. And those are the things we kind of break down, the difference between the accent, the dialect. My mom's been in the U.S. all my life, 34 plus years, and she still has a strong native tongue. So we talk about that, what is the process to learn a language? How much time goes in to learn a new language? Very interesting stuff here. And look, I really enjoyed this interview just because I was fascinated. Once again, it's all about getting out of your comfort zone and stretching yourself. Who can I interview that has nothing to do with business per se, right? Because we can all intertwine it and take it back. But Ms. Klimas, she was an absolute doll to talk to, and I hope you really enjoy this episode. And then I want to challenge you, right? Maybe it's a language that you kind of slacked on. Maybe you took Spanish in college or something and it's been on the back of your mind. This might be the thing, the motivator to push you forward. If it is, I want to hear from you. Hey everyone, welcome to a new episode of Networking with Michelle. Today's special guest is Janina Klimas. She is the author of Learn Any Language, a practical guide to learn any language to any level of fluency. And I thought this would be an interesting topic because most of us, we think we're too old to learn a new language. But she has this awesome book with some tips and tricks that she's going to share with us today. So Janina, welcome to the show. How are you doing?
I'm good, thank you.
So tell all of us about your story. You have a very interesting story in your book. I would love to hear it from you.
Okay. I grew up in an English-speaking home and, was somewhat interested in languages. So started taking them in high school, the sort of traditional, Spanish 1, French 1, etc. I had excellent teachers, and I definitely learned a lot, but I don't feel that, I left the experience sort of far from fluent, but with really good, strong conversational skills. And, I continued studying languages in college, and I then decided, I really want to know exactly how this works. When I went to college, I actually I grew up, had a very unusual sort of upbringing. I'm originally from the Washington, D.C. area, but that's really just for my father's job. And when I was 5, my father was a professor at the Naval Academy. So we lived in just outside of the Washington, D.C. area. And then he got a job with one of the government research labs. I don't know, Los Alamos and Sandia. So we moved to New Mexico when I was 5. And, there's no way you can escape that place without learning any Spanish. Everything is, even if people don't speak Spanish, the street names and neighborhood names, and it's just all over the place. So, I definitely became very interested. I became very aware of this. And later on, my parents got divorced, and we moved to New Hampshire with my mother, but then, sort of back and forth, And when I went to college, I went back to New Mexico, and I actually went to college about 10 minutes from the Mexican border. And it was interesting. So the kind of the higher up I went in my studies, more people were in my Spanish classes they were native speakers, and there were fewer and fewer non-native speakers. And of course I was learning from them, etc. But, I would ask a lot of people, the ones that were not native speakers that seemed to be pretty strong, how did you do this? I wanted, sort of a formula. I'm sitting here with all of these people that are crossing the border from Mexico to come to my Spanish classes. Well, what's, it's sort of like, the equivalent of sort of, English classes in American universities. That was really what it was. Well, how do people really learn languages? Nobody ever really had an answer for me. So after I graduated, I started teaching, and of course I studied abroad. I studied in Spain. I did a master's degree in Spain. And I really wanted to get down to how does this work? How does this work? And that's really what the book is about, about how long it takes to learn languages, how to assess yourself, how important that is, knowing about language assessment, focusing on proficiency, which is, of course, what you can do with a language, not necessarily just I took, X number of years of whatever language. So it's really about what you can do in the real world and how to assess that. So that's really what the book is about. And it talks about, after I graduated from college and started teaching, I got involved in overseas education, and I worked at a Korean university. So I was in Seoul for 3 years, and in the book I talk about my experience with, learning Korean. And then I was in Japan for 5 years, just outside of Tokyo. And my most recent sort of triumph in languages has been French. So, and I'm still working on it, but when I say triumph, I mean sort of going from, not having a whole lot of confidence and communication to, a much higher level. So I guess that's the summary right there.
Okay. Now, do you think you were at an advantage to learn a foreign language as a child/teenager versus, an actual adult?
That's an excellent question. So it's, there's so much, when you major in foreign languages, which was one of my majors, I double majored in foreign languages and theater arts, which I know is kind of strange, but that's what I loved. That's what I did. And, throughout my master's degree, you do a lot of courses in linguistics, all different kinds of linguistics. And there are a lot of theories out there about second language acquisition. And they talk about how, children's brains have, they can make connections that adults can't. And, none of it's really proven or founded, but there's certainly a lot of theories out there. But I'm not convinced that that's true. I'm honestly not convinced that that's true. And this is why. A lot of times, if you think about children learning languages, you have to think about the context. So now you're in Houston, which we talked, I know we talked on email about how Lake Jackson, et cetera, I know that in Houston, there are people from all over the world. It is so diverse there. And I love it there for that reason. I love it. You've got people from all over the world. And, think about these families that are coming from all kinds of places, and quite a few people who are coming from Mexico as well have settled in Houston. imagine that you're speaking Spanish until you're 5 years old and you start going to school, right? And then you go to school in English. Think about the amount of time that they are immersed in language when you're going to school in a language. And you think about the number of years. So I really do think it comes down to time. One distinct advantage I honestly think that children have over, well, actually there's two distinct advantages. One of them is the fact that if you take time out, just imagine that the time weren't a factor. I think that children can hear sounds that adults can't. After a certain age. In fact, it's quite funny. Years ago, there was this email going around among teachers, and it was a sort of, it had an MP3 attachment, and it said, if you teach, and I want to say that if you teach people that are older than 12, they won't, or I'm sorry, people under 12 will be able to hear the sound. People over 12, you won't hear the sound. So play the MP3. And it was true. I mean, it was absolutely true. I played this MP3. I couldn't hear it. People under 12 could hear it. And so if you think about the different types of sounds that are in different languages, how much it's really hard, obviously, to make a sound if you can't hear it, you can't understand it. One example might be in Korean, for example, the L and R sound that's one letter in Korean. That's one sound. So that would be after a certain age, some people are going to have a really hard time, making that sound because it's one sound to them. Or tones in Mandarin, for example, that would be another example. So I do think there's some distinct advantages and I think they're physiological. Now, the theories about brain synapses and all that they very well may be true, but I'm not convinced because I've worked with so many and known so many competent adult language learners. And when we say adult language learners, we're usually talking about people who are sort of 13, 14 years old and beyond, right? So, sort of high school time and beyond, middle school, high school time and beyond. And the other advantage that I honestly believe that kids have over anybody who has, gotten into sort of, puberty, middle school age sort of thing, is they have no affect. They haven't decided that this new thing is weird. This is, I mean, if you think about how self-conscious people can be as adults compared to children, they're not worried about making mistakes, which I think is a huge, 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 huge deal. Because I think that traditional foreign language programs, if you look at them if you look through the sort of textbook series, they really do a good job of laying out all the structures of a language, if that makes sense. So if you look at sort of the beginning of, a Spanish 1 book, for example, the very beginning, they've got all these nice, classroom commands, survival Spanish sort of thing. Go to the end of the level 3 book. It's amazing the progression they're getting into sort of these really complex structures that they're talking about. So, for example, they might teach the verb and sentence structures for people to say things like, if I had been born in the 1500s, my life would have been, and I can tell you that, kids in high school might be talking like this in an English class on a paper, but certainly not in most of their everyday speech. And to have the memory and to be able to learn all of those structures, it involves a really intense amount of, study and focus and memory. And oftentimes we don't allow the time for that, if that makes sense. It's just not built into the structure of the course. You might have, like, let's say that it would take you sort of 500 hours to get to a certain level, but you've really only got 300 or 250. Does that make sense?
It does. And I kind of want to piggyback off of that with two questions. Because, one, you identify what an adult is for as 13 and older learning a language.
Yeah, other people might say, but for language learning purposes, yeah, I would say about that age.
But I wanna raise that age up a little bit, and I'll just say 20s, mid 20s. What kind of mental shift do we need to take? Like, you know what? I need to learn this new language for my job. I want to work overseas. And how much time should we dedicate, or what is the average amount of time that an adult dedicates to learn a new language?
That's an excellent question. So I can tell you, I kind of learned Spanish. It was tough in many ways because, I tend to be, well, I've let go of it, a lot of it now, but, I can be a little bit of a perfectionist on certain things. And I think a lot of teenagers are, when I first started this, and also the programs sort of require that. So for example, a lot of these language tests that they give in schools are sort of, you'll get a point off for missing an accent, for example, or, that sort of thing, right? Instead of actually really focusing on communication. They've definitely gotten better. But the shift that I think that somebody, who's truly an adult, I think they need to be aware of how long the language that they want to take the language that they want to learn is going to take, and how they're going to fit this into their lives, if that makes sense. Because people learn languages in all different sorts of ways. I mean, some people learn it from, intense study. Some people, they're listening, in their car every day on their commute, for example. Some people are going online and getting conversation partners. Some people go to school and get degrees in the language. Some people go and quit their job instead. It really depends on what your life allows, for example. So how are you going to fit that in there? And then how difficult the language is. So, for example, I would say if you want to, for general sort of working proficiency in a language, it would be, say, a language like Spanish or French that are very closely related to English. They're it's sort of like being at your cousin's house once you get to know things a little bit. That's probably the way I would describe it. It's the same, but it's different. I mean, we celebrate the same holidays. We have sort of a lot of the same religions. There are a lot of foods that will seem familiar. A lot of values that are going to seem really familiar, right? And think about it. They're close to England, which is where English obviously comes from, So go further away from that, right? Just think geographically, go further away from that. Go to, go over to Asia, for example, or Russia. And I mean, the writing is different. The holidays are different. Russia obviously is much more closely related to English than Japanese or Mandarin or Korean is, or Thai, for example. But if you think about it that way, where the cultures are going to have, everything is going to be so different. It's going to obviously take you that much longer to learn, right? So to reach that sort of, level of proficiency that you could actually work, right? You might not have a very super rich life in this language, but it would be, for Spanish or French, it would probably be about 750 hours to 1,000 hours. And that first language is going to take you longer, right? Like I know a lot of the shortcuts now because I know how to get communicating with people, right? So if you can get communicating with people, then they're going to talk back to you. And that's actually where you're learning languages is the things that you understand, right? So you're constantly getting this meaningful back and forth, that you're taking from their language and then it's becoming yours. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. And I do want to get to that later. So in your book, can you just provide, I guess, a basic outline of the steps or the process on how you guide us to learn a new language?
So basically, what I talk about is I talk a lot about fluency in the very beginning. And I really believe that, I think that oftentimes fluency is terribly misunderstood, and it's not anyone's fault. I'm not blaming anybody, but I mean, it's this huge, people say fluent, and it's really interesting. People are constantly sharing with me their stories, and they have been for years, because this is really all I've ever done, as an adult. This has been my life. People always share their stories with learning languages with me. And I think that these completely, if you asked 10 people what it means to be fluent in a language, you would get 10 completely different answers. So, I go into real detail about those different levels of fluency. It's a continuum. It's not one black and white point. Yeah. Right. But that's a really good question, because there are so many different points. So you have to think about languages in terms of sort of tasks of things you can do. So for example, to have that basic, you talked about that basic conversation, hello, how are you? Okay, well, a conversation between you and somebody else could be you giving them advice on, your area of expertise of business and networking and speaking. Imagine doing that in another language, right? That's going to be up at the top of that sort of fluency. That's strong professional language that's going to take a long time to develop. I mean, it took you a long time to develop that in English. Just as it would for all of us, right? I see you have an MBA, you went to college. I mean, to get to that level of being able to, speak to large groups of people in big businesses, that didn't happen overnight. So, and then you go down, let's say go down the fluency list a little bit, sort of in between what we just talked about the language that you use as a professional, and then that very, hello, how are you? There's a whole lot of things in between, right? So I talk about that, about understanding those different levels of fluency, right? And then I talk specifically about how people learn languages and that whole comprehension piece, and how we understand what we hear, how we understand what we read, because that's a huge part of it. To really get to those high levels of language, you have to read a lot, but it's not like reading in your own language. It's completely different. So you have to treat it really differently. And I talk about how to assess your progress, because that's a big, important thing. And then the steps I talk about really specifically sort of after we've gone through what this all means, at the end, I have tasks to get you started with, and then resources. So, I strongly believe there is not one, I mean, there is one way to learn a language, but then there are many, if that makes sense. So, it's not a black and white concept. Oh, how do you learn a language? You use flashcards, you go to class. It's not like that. I mean, like I said, I learned, I learned Spanish through, essentially, the way I really learned Spanish was through living in Madrid and doing my master's degree. That was really it. And the way that I learned French, I can't really say that I learned French from my high school French. I learned a lot of things about French, if that makes sense. I learned how to, I learned about verbs, and I learned this, but really because my partner is French, I live with a French person. I don't, I'm hearing it all the time. So that's really how I learned it. So I think it's that what I really try to convey is that really understanding how languages are learned, so that you can take those things and make them work for you in your life.
What are some tips you have for someone that they're not able to travel, or let me back up. They can travel, but they just can't spend that month in Spain, right?
Just like a lot of people can.
Right, but how can they find a new local community where they can practice their Spanish, practice their French?
A great question. It obviously, a lot of this depends on where you live, because if you live in the middle of nowhere, there's nobody to talk to anyway. But if you live in Houston, there's going to be, different places that you can go. But one thing that I would say is fairly reliable would be online. I can't believe how much the internet has changed language teaching and learning. When I was a young language teacher, you wouldn't believe the number of suitcases I have of videos and photos and DVDs and realia and tickets to bring culture, which is a huge part of languages. You have to understand culture, the culture of the language you're learning, into my classroom. it's now all available online, which is fantastic. So you can connect with native speakers. One site that I have not used because I haven't had a need to, because I have my, got my French speaking partner in the same house with me. But if I were to endeavor, very intentionally to look for a native speaker, it would be, there's a site called iTalkI, and you actually sign up for to speak with a native speaker. They're tutors online so that you could, and you're the boss because you're the client. So you would decide, how you might use your time. So if you wanted to practice, for example, we'll take kind of a beginning level task. Let's say that you wanted to practice how to check into a hotel. Let's just say that. But you wanted to get that down. You would sort of, maybe do your studying beforehand, and you let the teacher know this is what all the things that you want to practice, the conversations that you want to have. Obviously they can be a lot less scripted. All of this stuff can be a lot less scripted the further on you go, right? The higher up you get, the more spontaneous you can be with languages. So beginner levels, so sort of the first few hundred hours in a language like French or Spanish or Italian, that's close. And we're talking the first, 1,000 hours of a language like Mandarin or Arabic, that's really different from English. It's going to take you a while to get enough words into your head to be able to make your own sentences. Does that make sense? So when you get up to that point where you can sort of really make your own sentences, you do a lot of free conversation, but don't let that limit you. I would say the more contact that you can have with people, communicating with real people, the better. And they're out there online. You can hire tutors even on places like Upwork or on Fiverr, to where you can just connect with them and say, okay, here's our lesson, 2 hours this week, or then you can also, it's not going to be realistic. You're not going to be online 24/7 with people. You're going to go to work. You're going to, be cleaning the kitchen or whatever. I love audio programs for this reason. Mm-hmm. So for beginners, there's so many, on audible.com or on Amazon where, you've got Pimsleur, you've got all these different great things for beginners that you can listen to while you're commuting to work, or, while you're doing the dishes, while you're going out for a walk, really making it fit into your life, if that makes sense. And that's one of my big points in the book is, you're going to have to, just because you have a certain circumstance doesn't mean that you can't work around that to learn a new language.
When you're learning a new language, should you also be learning to write the language?
Well, that's an excellent question. So writing is the thing that we develop last in languages. And I, if you think back to, I'm not sure what your experience was like as a student, but, people complain about, a lot of students complain, oh, I have a paper to write. Think about it. And I realize that it's not sort of, free writing or texting or, this is formal, you're going to get graded on it. There's a lot of pressure there that you're not going to have in a lot of other sort of things that you might write. But it's something that people develop last. You have to be really thoughtful and concise to really clearly communicate on paper. I mean, think about the number of misunderstandings people have over emails and texts and things being, a tone can be really misinterpreted. So it takes a long time. But as far as learning how to write, I would say that yes and no. Okay. I shouldn't say yes and no, actually. I would say yes, but I would say in the very beginning, what I really want to say actually is in the very beginning, I would definitely focus mostly. I like to get the sound part down first. I like to get speaking and communicating a little bit, because when you learn how to write, you're going to have to, how do I say this? Okay. Basically when the written word, whether we've written it or someone else has written it and we're reading it, is a visual representation of our spoken language, right? Yeah. So it, when you think about when you start school, for example, we teach kids how to speak first before we teach them how to read and write. And reading and writing is fundamentally important. But if I had, as for very beginners, absolute beginners, I had say 60 minutes to work with them. It would be, I would spend 50 or 55 minutes in oral work at first and maybe 5 on written. But when you start getting into, once you've got a few of these patterns down and sounds, etc., I think that absolutely working on writing is really good. And it's going to be really important to do that too. For example, like when you're learning Japanese, you're going to have to learn kanji. To be able to read in other languages, you're going to have to understand how those patterns work. In those languages that are closer to English, it's much easier, obviously, to do that because they're very similar. So if you've dabbled in Spanish, you probably know that the vowels all look the same, but they're said completely, they're said completely differently. And then in a language like Spanish, French, Italian, those are, close to English. One thing I really like to use, basically writing to learn. So I have a journal and, let's say that I've just learned how to talk about family in a new language. I like to put on a timer and say for 7 minutes, I'm going to write down as much as I can talking about my family. For example, who's in my family, what people look like, anything I can say about them in that time. And one thing that's really great about that's something you can do on your own. And then you can also see what your gaps are. So what words did you not know? And you don't look them up. You're kind of testing yourself there. And it's amazing. After a few months, you'll see like the beginning of the notebook. If you do this on a regular basis, just for a few minutes as you're studying a language. And it can even be little conversations that you're writing out. It could be something as simple as, getting a taxi. What would you say? And what would the other person say? You could kind of just test yourself on these things. You'd be stunned at how much you learn. So yes and no, if that makes sense. I would say that get some basics down and feel comfortable saying hello to people before you get into worrying too much about reading to learn, because I think that's one of the big mistakes. When we teach kids how to read, right? Those first few years of school, they're learning to read, and then you read to learn. And I think we apply that to foreign languages, and it's very true, but it's almost skipping that step, that fundamental step in language, even though we can do it, I think, much more quickly, because if you're literate in your native language, you can certainly be literate in another language. That's not
and I really enjoy how you're breaking everything down, because when I ask the question, I'm thinking, well, I'm already an adult. I have comprehension abilities, right? And I should be able to learn this stuff simultaneously. But every time I listen to you, I kind of feel like it's childhood development all over again when it comes to learning a new language. And I took French in high school.
But you get to do it much more quickly, I think, which is the nice. That makes sense, because you've already got all these skills there. But I just think it's a matter of understanding it, because I think people get really frustrated with themselves. We're like, okay, well, we're asking you, how do I put this? Okay, when you learn a language in the way that most of us do, we're born and we have parents and family that are around us, and we have stories read to us, and we interact with people in our community, and then we go to school, and you think about all of those things that get you to the point where you are now. It's natural, isn't it? I mean, it's really pretty easy. But then you think about learning a foreign language. Somebody put this beautifully one time, and he said, it's like taking a sofa and moving it up to the 3rd floor. It's hard, but you can do it. You're going to have to put a different kind of effort into it. Then it's not just going to come to you. And, unless you have, you've got to have access to this stuff, and as an adult who's not living in a country where this language is spoken, you're going to have to find those things. But the good news is, if it's Spanish that you're wanting to learn, there are more Spanish speakers in the United States than in Spain.
Oh, and wait, more than Spain?
Right. There are, the last statistic I heard was, I want to say there's 40 million Spanish speakers in Spain, and there are 44 million in the United States. So, and you know what? A lot of those people obviously didn't study abroad. So you can learn Spanish too.
Well, I guess that makes sense, because obviously, I'm in Houston, Texas. I teach at a college. predominantly Hispanics, and then you have a pool of just Latinos. Yeah. And within that pool, Mexican, Latin America, they have their own dialects, and they all, speak differently within the Spanish dialect. So yeah, I can see that now. I can see that now. So my parents are from Cameroon, West Africa. You have the English speaking and the French speaking, and then they have their native tongues. My mom, she grew up in the English speaking, and my mom, I love my mom. There's no ding on her. 60 something years old. She's been in the States, I'll just say all my life, 35 years. She still has a dialect. Yeah, she still has her accent. So you did say you taken some linguistic classes. Can you chime in on that? Why some people don't lose their accent or anything like that?
There's so much debate about that. I mean, if you think about it, it could be that, first of all, I mean, maybe you don't want to. It's how you say these words. It's how you grew up. I've lived in England for 10 years, and I'm clearly, from the United States. And I know there's some patterns and certain words that I use now that I would have never used before. But I really don't have any interest in losing my accent, but let's just say that you needed to. Let's just imagine that you needed to. So one really good example, I think, and I always found this really fascinating. So when I was a kid, I had a huge crush on, I don't know if you know who he is. I'm going to date myself here. Rick Springfield, right? Do you know who that is?
You said Bruce Spring?
No. Rick Springfield.
No, I don't.
Okay. See, I'm dating myself here. So he was on some soap opera, and he was really good looking. And I thought, wow. And, he spoke, and I'm listening to him. And I remember finding out that he was Australian. And I thought, what? He has an American accent. And so many actors, to be able to work, will do accent reduction programs. So that's a whole concerted effort that they're making to be able to work. Does that make sense? So I mean, it's a matter of, I honestly believe, going back to the things we talked about with sounds, two people have said to me in the last week, they said, when you speak English, you speak like an American. And when you speak Spanish, you speak like a Spaniard. No, because I that's where I really got good at Spanish, was in Spain. So I know I have a sort of Madrid, accent, quote unquote, because I paid attention to the patterns of the way they said words. I wasn't trying to affect that, but that's just was the result. And I have a degree in theater arts as well, and I've been an actress, so I was always really interested in, and I could do accents when I was really active in it too. I mean, I think I don't practice so much anymore, but I mean, really listening to how people say words. So I believe that if you want to do that, you can. If you need to do that, you can. And then, let's say that you decide, you want to have less of an accent. And so you're going to do some training to try to really truly understand how words are said, and then replicate that, if that makes sense. And then, but then back to that physiological thing that I talked about certain sounds and certain languages for certain people, they can't hear it. So they can't produce it. So that could be a stumbling block for some people. And with working with so many people over the years, I've noticed some are just like parrots, they'll say it exactly like you said it, and they sound exactly like you. And then some just struggle, but I don't believe that that's not a deal breaker. I think if people can understand you in a new language, that's the whole point, is to communicate with them. If you're Rick Springfield and you want to work in Hollywood and you're from Australia, then maybe you need to drop the Australian accent.
But doesn't everyone have an accent?
Yeah. My British niece just said that. Julia, can you say hi? Hi. And I have to tell you, she is actually, we call her her father is from Corpus Christi, but she grew up here. So Julia, can you just tell her, she's in Houston, near the house in Lake Jackson. So she's close. She's very close to where we go. Okay, so can you just talk to her just a little bit? Tell her a little bit about your life, please.
I am 10 years old.
Where do you live?
I live in England.
Okay, and you go to an English school, don't you?
Yes.
Okay. However, your parents are both American from Texas, right? So,
Yes.
so anyway, there's an example of your environment of, she's listened to, obviously, she's my sister's kid. My sister is also American, but she grew up going to a British school. That's her accent. That's how she speaks.
This is cool. Because it's like you notice these things, but it's like, who am I going to talk to about this? And I can't be like, Mom, when are you going to lose your accent? Like, she'll probably slap me.
Is it a problem?
No.
Yeah.
No, I mean, it's definitely not. I mean, come on now. That's what I grew up with. I don't
know if I should repeat this, but
if your mom still has an accent, then it gives you room to make fun of her.
Well, I think it just amazes me when you have people, I guess, obviously in America, that have just been here for a long time and they still sound like they're back home. So that's what amazes me.
But I think honestly, as far as the research goes, that's the amount of time with language and culture, because people can move to another country and cluster with people from, they're spending all their time with people from their own culture. I have a friend who, she was born in Portugal and grew up in Boston, and her parents are in their 80s now. And I mean, she does most of the things that they need for them in English, like translating with doctors and hospitals and all of it. And this is part of what she and her sister do all the time. And it was the way their lives were set up. They lived in a community with, they never really let go of that. They never really fully integrated or fully assimilated, if that makes sense. And because they didn't need to, they were around cousins and family and, whereas my friend, of course, who grew up in the United States and went to school in the United States, was naturally assimilated. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
So I think it depends on your level of, of immersion. I have another friend who has a mother who grew up in Italy, actually, and she had a really, she did not want to go back there, just an unhappy upbringing, it was just not, and she was so happy to become an American and have that, and she almost never wanted to visit. I mean, she worked hard at becoming American in her speech and because she wanted to let go of that other part of her life. So it's really the time you invest in it, I think.
All right. So what do you have planned for 2017?
Oh my goodness. Okay. So, I'm not so much. That's my problem. I've always got, I have a million things I want to do. And of course I have to pick and choose. So, I want to continue. I've done a lot of, guidebooks for beginners that are sort of, they're connected to audio. So, beginning survival language in like beginning survival, getting around, understand, beginning survival greetings, beginning survival getting to know people in 11 languages. And I've been working on those sort of, I've worked at them sort of in batches. I've got them to one level and then I think, I want to do this next step with it, take it to the next step. So I've done that and I'm going to be working a lot on that. They're free. And, putting those out there, that's definitely early 2017, which is great because I think, people get a lot. It's a good time to, it's definitely a good time to start a new language. People are inside, it's cold, there's not a whole lot to do. You can read it on your phone. You can listen to all the audios from native speakers. I have for example, I have Japanese for travel and beginners, and I have French for dating, which I made with my partner. So I'm very focused on specific task-based language learning, if that makes sense. And when I say tasks, I mean, for example, talking about, telling someone all about your childhood would be an example of a task, or language to talk about going out drinking for the night, or whatever it is that you need to be able to communicate. And so the guidebooks are all organized like that. So that's a big part of 2017. I'd really like to do another book, but that's geared towards people who consider themselves to already be fluent in a language, getting to that really high level that we talked about, the specifics, how to do that, how to hit that really, really real confidence, real, that level that we really want, the ESL kids to get to, for example, when they're going, through school, that confident communication, to be able to write and read and really express themselves really clearly.
And how many languages do you speak?
To varying levels of fluency. I'm a native English speaker, bilingual, in Spanish. I'd say, those are my two really strong languages. The next one down would be French, and I can communicate in French. Like I'm going to France on Saturday. We're going to Christmas. We have a house there for Christmas. I can understand Italian. Really, it's so similar to Spanish that it's crazy. So whenever I go there, I consider myself, survival Italian. I lived in Japan for 5 years, and people say it's really interesting. In fact, the other night we had some people over, and a friend of mine just came back from Japan. She's French, and Monday night she came over to tell us all about her trip there. And, we're talking about the places that, we both know because I was there for a long time. And they think I speak fluent Japanese. My partner thinks I speak fluent Japanese. We've traveled, and I've had to speak to Japanese people, like asking where the ATM is. And I don't consider myself fluent at all by any means. But, obviously I can order food. I can, there's a lot of things I can do. Maybe some people would consider myself fluent. I certainly don't.
Okay.
And I speak Korean.
And Korean, so 6. Okay.
So again, that's varying levels of fluency. So if you told me to go, write a novel in Korean, I certainly couldn't do it.
But you're ahead of most.
Well, I'm ahead of some people. Certainly, no one else in Korea. So,
how can people get in touch with you?
So I have I'm on Twitter, Real Life Lang. And I'm on Facebook, Real Life Language, and I'm on Pinterest. And I have a blog called reallifelanguage.com/reallifelanguageblog. And I have audio in 11 languages, plus a lot of, cool tidbits, little things I find. I put projects there for language teachers. But all the audio is free and downloadable. So you can sort of make your own playlists. I think we have French, Italian, Spanish, and I have some very immersive Spanish materials on there. When I say immersive, they are they're real conversations with native speakers. So it's got all the pauses in there and the just exactly the way people speak. So I want to say 3 of those. There's Mandarin, and there's Thai, German, Greek, French. The French for dating is on there. Japanese, Korean, and I think Greek is on there. I think some Greek, which I've dabbled in Greek a little bit just because our stepfather was from Greece. And so we've been to Greece and, little bit of Greek, not much at all, but a little bit. So you'll find, and it's all recorded by native speakers from all these different places.
Gotcha. Well, I definitely want to just acknowledge you for coming on the show. This has opened up a whole new world for me. I definitely want to share this among my circle. I know I have some friends that are looking to brush up on their Spanish. This is very impressive. Thank you.
Thank you. No, thank you. And I want to thank you. I love your website. I love all the different things you're doing, and I'm excited about reading your book. That's what I'm going to do in 2017, by the way.
The final question, how do you define success?
Okay. I guess I would define success by, you're making me think, Michelle. Define success by feeling happy that I made myself better than I was before. If that makes sense. That I did something good. The ability to get back up when you're down, because it's going to happen.
Oh, yeah.
My sister just said that to me, and you're absolutely right. Yeah, resilience and feeling good about, like, I'm doing something good in the world. I'm offering something. I'm using my talents and my skills in a way that can help people.
There you have it. But let's make sure we stay resilient in 2017. Remember, I believe in you. A personal connection leads to an influential network. So thanks for networking with Michelle.